Stems feel like there's, it came out 5 years ago or something. Like, oh, now we're using stems. Stems is the new way to finish your audio production, blah, blah, blah. But the fact is that stems have been around truly forever and for a lot of reasons. I think and this is not historical, and I'm not going for historical accuracy. This is my impression and my experience, my direct experience, but I don't know the actual history. But when you were doing an analog mix with an analog console and a tape machine and a patch bay, you were in some room wherever you were in the world, and you were mixing for $1,000 a day, or $1,500 a day, or $2,000 a day, or $3,000 a day, whatever it was, but it wasn't $50. You would build these big analog mixes because that's what there was. And there was patch bays, and there was outboard gear, and there were dials, and there was all kinds of things. And as we know, mixes are very, very sensitive. And so if you mixed for 8 hours, 10 hours, 11 hours, and you got it really good, but you were running out of time and they were going to kick you out of the studio, and you didn't know if you could come back to fix some things, fix some little thing, people started to realize that it was cool to create composite submixes. That's what stems are. They're composite submixes with all the sauce baked in, because that's what there was. And so this way, even if you had a 24 channel mix or a 32 channel mix, and you had all kinds of stuff going, and you were getting kicked out of that $1,000 a day studio with that $300 a day mix engineer, or $3,000 a day, depending on where you were, you would have at least your submixes that you could play with. Even before DAWs, that's what I'm saying. You could print submixes to, another reel of tape, if you will. And then when you went to a cheaper studio or a different studio and you brought up those submixes, you could make tonal changes and you could do balancing. Could you subtract the reverb from a composite mix or a stem mix that had reverb baked in and delay baked in? No, but that's okay, right? I mean, I think we all know sometimes trying to leave everything virtual is a dangerous business, right? That very often blows up in our face. And we're here to make music, which means we're making decisions and we're committing to them. Levels of commitment at different junctures in the production process and the decision-making process, that's a good thing, right? That is a good thing. So that's the origin of stems, was because if you wanted to make some changes and some little balances, turn the vocal up. Let's say you had a spectacular mix, but your vocal was too quiet. Are you really going to recall a whole analog mix and a patch bay and outboard gear just to turn the vocal up a dB or 0.7 of a dB? That was a crazy way to live. So this came out of the analog world for sure. And then people realized, wow, digital audio workstations were great for playing with stems. You could load them up. So then obviously if you mix in an analog studio and then Pro Tools came along, you could load up your stems into Pro Tools, and then you could play with your stems at home in your pajamas and without a big hourly rate. And you could experiment and you could make final tonal changes and things like this. And it was very flexible because you had all your beautiful pieces, but you could play with them until you were happy. When it comes to doing music for television and film, it's all about the stems, right? I've been fortunate to have quite a bit of music in major Hollywood films and independent films at Sundance, and I've been working in television film for decades now. And it would kind of work like this, right? You would have friends that were music supervisors that you would meet in New York City, and go out for drinks and buy them lunch and try to bribe them to use your music and stuff. And then you would give them some music, maybe a CD back in the day or files, whatever. And you wouldn't hear from them for a long time. And then 9 months later, you get a call in the morning. Hey, guess what? I'm working on a film. We have your song in the film, and it's working perfectly. And you'd be like, oh wow, those $32 martinis were worth it. Now I'm going to be in a film. And then the next question that the music supervisor would ask you is, do you have stems? Because right now it's working perfectly, but there's vocals in the way of the dialogue. So I just need to be able to have my, my music editor, which is a different job, play with the stems to get the vocals out of the way so you can hear who Gwyneth Paltrow is saying or whatever it is. And what is your answer as a producer? The answer should be, yeah, I have my stems. And so where am I going with this is make stems when you finish your tracks and your productions. Even if you're still not happy, even if you still want to play with things, even if it feels like the never-ending story, make stems then and save them and label them and check them. Because if someone calls you 3 years later and they're like, that song you gave me 3 years ago, I'm putting it in the new Spider-Man 7 movie. Can I get stems? How easy do you think it is to recall a mix from 5 years ago and have everything open up and play nicely? You're asking for trouble, right? So part of finishing every track should be some stem creation just to archive what you have. Every time you finish something that you think is of value, not every rough mix that you ever did, but something that's really done and of value, go ahead and create the stems. Back in the day, the stem making often was very simple. You would usually have a drum stem with all the drums, almost the way that I still set up for my old school self, folders, right? You'd have a drum stem with all of your drums, and that would include all your reverbs, all your everything, your drumapella, we would call that a drumapella. Then you would have all your basses. Then you would have all your instruments and all your vocals. And what this would allow you to do is if you had done a fancy analog mix, or you had mixed at another studio, or you mixed at a studio where the monitoring was weird, but you still wanted to get some work done, you could balance your drums, your basses, your instruments, and your vocals and make a new balance, right? And this was cool. And this actually worked really, really well. And if you're giving your music to a music supervisor, that's all they would need, really. Usually they wouldn't be like, oh, can you take out that one hi-hat? Not typical. And even with that, the editors have tricks. So sometimes 4 stems was the basic stem making model. And that's kind of where it would start. And actually, even before that was just be the instrumental and the a cappella for music with vocals. And this way you could balance the vocals, but have your exact perfect mix. So that's really where it started with that. And then it broke out into 4 stems and then 8 stems. And now you can make as many stems as you want to have control over. Very typical if you were a mixer mixing in a non-ideal mixing environment, but you went to a fancy mastering, the mastering engineer would sometimes ask for stems because this way they can do a stem mastering. And so what that allows you to do is if the mix is not perfect, but is good, but needs some help, you could apply the mastering chain to the stems and then manipulate the stems with the mastering chain on to get the balances that you're looking to get. right? So this worked very, very well. So it didn't take long for mastering engineers and mixing engineers to want to have control of the kick, right? They didn't want drum stems anymore. Drum stems were cool, but what if they hated your kick? Or what if your kick wasn't as good as it could be? They were married to your kick because your kick was baked into the drum stem. And kick is everything, right? Kick is king, kick is queen. Kick is if your kick isn't kicking, your whole party is not happening, depending on the style of music. So then what engineers would say is, give me your drum stem minus the kick and give me the kick by itself, right? So that I have your kick stem with all your stuff on it. I have your drumapella minus kick, and I can balance your kick and EQ your kick and saturate your kick. And that made engineers happy, right? Mastering engineers in particular. Then they also said, I'll take your bass appella, but if you have two basses and you have one of them is a sub bass, give me that separate. Because where the sub sits in the balances in mastering, as we know, we're a school of low frequencies and subs, chakras, it's critical. And if your bass, your guitar-y bass, is married to your subby bass and you can't separate them, you also don't have as much control. So that became a trend. Then sometimes mastering engineers, mixing engineers, I'll just say, they said, I like your acapella, but can you give me the lead separate from the backgrounds? Because I have some things I want to fix on the lead tone and balances, but when they're married in the chorus, I can't get at them. So then those started to separate. So you see what's happening here. You see what's happening in the trend. People wanted more and more submixes, more and more stems for more control. And then EDM came along and a lot of, sort of bedroom producers who had not fancy monitoring, had not fancy engineering expertise, but wanted to make music and had a lot of musicality. And they would do mixes, but the mixes were not mixer mixes. They weren't fancy, but they were cool. So then the finishing engineers would say, just give me all your stems. And this way I don't have to call you 18 times and ask you for things. And then I have great latitude when it comes to dialing this stuff in. So then stems went from 2 stems to 4 stems to 8 stems to 42 stems. Now, is there anything wrong with having 42 stems? Is there anything bad about it? No, there isn't, because what you will do and what we'll do in mastering is we'll have some of these projects with lots of stems. You only have to mess with them if you're hearing something that's bugging you. Other than that, if you leave the stems at unity, you're getting that producer's mix, their interpretation of what those relationships should be. But if the tambourine is driving you nuts or you need more cowbell, you can turn up the cowbell. And you know what? When people give me 42 stems, it doesn't make me sad. It makes me happy. I pretend I don't have them just to unclutter my mind. I can even put them in one folder so I don't have to look at all the tracks. But if all of a sudden something is weird, I can address it easily. So there is nothing wrong with making tons of stems. That being said, do you need to make a stem out of everything? Do you need to? And I'm going to also say no. If you have a stem making scheme, matrix that makes sense for you, you can mix and match. You can have some stuff be by itself. Definitely kick by itself I think you definitely want that. You want sub bass by itself. But could you have your hi-hats and your tambourine live on one stem? Do you think that is that okay? I say yes, sure. If you had 4 acoustic guitar parts that you made an acoustic guitar bus and you loved all the tonal relationships in the blend, could you just bounce an acoustic guitar stem? Yes. Same with backgrounds. I think lead and backgrounds being separate is very useful. But if you have, whatever it is, 128 background tracks, do you need to make a separate stem for each one of those? I'd say no. Right? Can you make a stereo background stem? Sure. Could you make a bridge stem and a chorus stem? Yes. When you finish your mix, you can start to, and each production, there's no rule to this, but each production, you can start to combine things just because you can. And just because they're like things. You usually like to sort of combine things in similar frequency ranges, right? So if I had congas and bongos, I could make a stem of those. But if I had bongos and timpani drum, they're in different frequency ranges, they wouldn't make a nice pair. So the way you pair them up is definitely just according to you. And guess what? If all of a sudden you're stem mastering or someone is stem mastering for you and they want you to break out your stems further, it's not a big deal. You just do it, right? So that's the philosophy with that. Now, when you make your stems, this is a good question though. It's philosophical and it's a good question. How do you know? And this is not rhetorical, but literally, how do you know when you're done with a mix? When you get that place in a mix where everything else you try, you liked it better before, I think you're also done, right? How about when you compare it to the reference that you've been using for that mix journey, and all of a sudden you like yours better than the reference? It's another way of knowing that you're done. So deadlines, everything else you try makes it worse. You're comparing really well to the reference, knowing full well that you're going to get some extra quality when you do the mastering, you're done. And that is when you're done. And that's when it's time to bounce out a stereo bounce and then also do your stem making. Okay. So now I am going to recommend that you check your project setup. I highly, highly, highly recommend to everyone that you should be working 48K, 32 floating point. I know for a long time, I thought that little bit of difference wasn't worth it for sample rate conversion, headaches and stuff. But we did quite a bit of testing last year, blind testing with lots of people in lots of genres. And everybody said that 48 sounded a little bit better than 44.1. So I recommend that all of your mixes and your productions and stuff should be in your mix session 48, 32 floating point. If you start with 24-bit files, then yes, absolutely. When you start your mix, you import them to a new session that's 48, 32, and they'll get converted so that all of your processing, channel strip processing that you do is more HD. So if someone gives you 16-bit 44.1 stems, which is fine, you're going to mix them 48, 32 floating point. And I'm pretty sure that everybody's DAW that they're using now can do that. Now, even though your mixes may end up, CD format is 44.1, 16-bit, but we know if you stay high resolution until the last minute, you will have more resolution when you go to the smaller file format. And we tested it quite a bit. So you should be all mixing 48, 32 float, regardless of what it was recorded, what the stems are, what your sample packs are, or whatever. When you import these files into your session, they will get upsampled, and then all the processing that you apply to them, They will benefit from more zeros and ones, for less rounding off, for more precision. So the stems we're going to make are also going to be 4832. Now, if you're sending mixes around to people and labels and collaborators, you're probably going to send them a 48 24-bit mix to preview or master to preview. So don't worry about that. But when you make the stems, make them 32-bit. Okay. So this is, in whatever DAW you're using, you just check what resolution you're working at, and that's fine. Now, there's a couple ways to do this. The first thing is highlight your in the timeline, in your event window, in your arrange window, whatever you want to call it, highlight the entire production and make sure that you render all of your stems from absolute 0 in the session, or bar 1, beat 1, or 0, or whatever you want to call it. Do not, it's dangerous to bounce everything from bar 3. I know some people like to do that. I highly recommend you don't do that. It will come back to bite you. So, just, even if there's space and you're like, oh, I'm going to spend an extra 11% of hard disk space because there's silence, just do it. It keeps things brainless in a good way. So go to the absolute beginning of the session and then highlight, also select, give it a little extra room for no reason at the end. Don't make it tight to the end because of reverb tails and whatever else. So give yourself a little extra bit at the end, bar 1, beat 1, or 0 the session. Give yourself a little reverb tail, and that's for starters. Don't play with this location selection for each stem. Don't be like, oh, well, this only happens in the beginning, so I'm going to make a short stem because I don't want to spend the hard disk space. Just leave it, please. I want to see when there's 48 stems that they're all the exact same size. Different sizes, different things. It just gets cute. You think you're being frugal. It just ends up somehow to not work out well. So make all your stems the exact same length and select your whole session and leave some reverb tails at the end. Okay. So now from here, there are 2 different approaches in a sense. One is a job that you do by hand, and it's time consuming, little labor intensive. You start with your drums and you start with your kick and you solo your kick. You would go to your export menu and we're going to bounce it through the stereo out. And it's also, so you would change out, you go to single in this DAW and you go to your stereo out. And you would label it kick stem, and you would make sure it was 44. And then you would make sure, if you've been sending people 24-bit stems, you would make it 32 float. Now, the question is, what do you keep on your mix bus, right? What do you keep on your stereo out? So in our school, for the most part, we like to mix with a sparse mix bus. We don't like to have a ton of sauce on the mix bus because we want our mixes to look good naked. We don't want to put some crazy extreme stuff on the mix bus that if you took it off, your mix would make absolutely no sense to anybody in the world. And it only makes sense with those extreme settings with that plug-in on your master bus. That sucks. Don't do that. People do it. People do a lot of stuff. But I think that that's a bad way to work for a whole bunch of reasons. So we don't like to have too much stuff on our mix bus. We have a little API Vision doing nothing. We have a little ATR with our magic settings. And then we have a little placeholding limiter, which is just giving us a squeeze so that as we're mixing, we can reference easier If we send it out to people, it'll be a little bit more baked, which is what people are used to. And it also just gives us a little bit of energy, enthusiasm, vibes while we're mixing, because it has a little squeeze on it. Feels like the music we grew up with, it also had a little squeeze on it. So what on this mix bus do I want the kick to have? Do I want limiter on my stems? Do I want a limiter on my stems? I can't tell you how many stems I've gotten, and I'm sure you have gotten too, when you collaborate, where people keep the limiter on all the stems and there's no headroom and they're all smashed. And they're like, come on, play with my petrified wood, and it's not malleable. You can't, when something that's been that limited, that hardened up, you can't bend it and shape it and carve it anymore. All you can do is look at it or break it or something. So we want the limiter, we want this bypassed, right? Now, do you want your console and your tape on all of your stems? Do you? Here's my philosophy on this. If you're going to be the one to do the stem mastering, then you may want to bypass them. Because when you load up all your stems and you reconstruct your mix bus as a starting place for your mastering chain, you can play with it more. You can be like, you know what? I mixed this on an API virtually, but what if I was wrong? What if it's better on a Neve? What if it's better on an SSL? Well, you're the mastering engineer, so you can reconstruct exactly what you listen to, but you can also play with it, right? So if and you can put your ATR on, but you can play with the ATR settings. So I'm going to say, if you're the one doing it, I would bypass everything, right? That's what I would do. Now, what if you're sending it to some label's mastering engineer that you've never met, that you don't know who this person is, and you love your mix because you really worked hard on your mix? What do you do then? Do you leave them on or do you take them off? You leave them on, right? Whatever that person's going to do, they don't know your puzzle as well as you know your puzzle. Plus, you love your sound, even if you want to experiment with it later. So you're going to then bounce your stems through everything, but not the limiter. And then when they inherit these stems, they sound all API-ish and ATR-ish, and they sound really good. And you put your indelible stamp on things that they can't take away from you. Does that make sense? Does everyone follow this? Okay, good. Is it legal, if you're the one who's going to be doing the mastering, to leave your console and your tape on your stems? Yes. But I think it's nice to be able to play with it, and to make adjustments and not have it as quite as baked in. The most valuable stems for the outside world are with these things enabled. The most valuable stems to you to put on your mad scientist hat. Movie example, you'd want them on. Yes, absolutely. Well, the next logical talking point is, you want your reverbs baked into each stem. If I go here to some synthy thing, and I have a send that's sending to a room, and I bounce this stem out, regardless of what I keep on my master bus, I want my reverb in that stem. And every stem is stereo, isn't it? Are we going to make any mono stems? No. Why? Because we have stereo reverb and stereo effects. So everything is stereo 4832 float. Why do why do I want my reverb baked into each stem? The reason is because you worked hard on getting those reverbs. And two is if you ask someone to recreate your reverb magic, you're asking for a lot of work and you're kind of asking for problems. And three, as you do some overall saturation, compression, EQ, whatever, if your reverb is divorced from your track, the tonal, and you have like, oh, well, here's my guitar return track from my reverb. If you make tonal changes to your guitar, that whatever what used to be sent to your reverb return track, there'll be a mismatch. There'll be a disconnect, right? Your dry sound won't match your reverberated sound and it will sound weird. When you're doing a stem mastering, can you take the reverb out of your stem? Not really. I mean, there's some tools and things, but they're not very satisfying. If you ran into a problem where you were stem mastering and you hated your acoustic guitar reverb, you would then have to go back to the mix, make that change, rebounce the stem. It has happened many times in music production history, and it's not the end of the world to do little spot fixes and things. But we want our reverbs baked into each stem. How about side chaining? Do we want side chaining baked into our stems? Or yes, of course you do. With all of the fancy side chaining everyone's doing, that is your groove, right? You've created a groove with all that side chaining. Asking yourself to recreate that in stem mastering, that's mean. Asking someone else to figure out all the side chaining you had going on and make your groove like you had it, that's a bad idea. So you want your side chaining baked in. And since our sends, our side chain sends, are they pre-fader or post-fader? They're pre, right. So what you have to make sure is when you solo something, that it's listening to the pre-fader send that's coming from that muted track. And that muting a track from soloing another track, if it's your ghost kick, doesn't mute the send. So in Cubase, hiding here in the preferences is something here in on this little VST thing, there's something called mute pre-send when mute. We don't want that checked. We want our pre-send to send on our ghost kick or on our kick, even if that kick is not being soloed, presuming that the kick is the trigger of the side chain so that everything grooves. Does everyone follow that? So in your DAW, you just have to make sure that your side chaining is being preserved when you bounce your stems. So when you load all of those stems up, you didn't lose your groove. Very important. Keep your side chaining baked in, keep your reverb baked in. Valentine says, if you bounce every stem with console and tape, would it not add up to maybe a possible different sound? Yes, it would, Valentine. It is a little different sound. Lots of things individually hitting tape is not the same as everything playing at the same time hitting the tape. And that is a very good point. Valentine, it's also true that everything soloed going through the reverb is not the same as everything playing at the same time going through the reverb. So when you make these stems, it's not perfect. It's really good. It's even excellent, but it's not exactly identical. You follow that when you do it in that way. Even with baking in the reverb, one snare going to, or you usually have a dedicated snare reverb, but like individual elements going to a reverb soloed is not the same as when they're all playing at once and the way it excites the reverb room. So there's a couple little differences, but it's okay. All right, listen, wonderful to see everyone. Cheers.